So what this right here is one of the early builds that I did with the steel cage bearings and the gutted intake. So basically it's the top end for an X-Torq that has the gutted intake. The boot's gutted, and of course the intake port was changed a little bit to facilitate that. And this one's been in service for a little while, came back running lean, and there's a fair amount of movement here in this bearing. So I don't know if the steel cage bearing itself failed, or is this another one of those case failures. So that's what we're going to find out, and I'm sure curious minds want to know. And true to form, in my channel, whatever I learn and discover and see, you know, I've been waiting for one of these to come back. You know, to see whether or not they fail in the same way as the OEM nylon cage, because that was my big thing, remember? So let's split it apart and let's take a look and see what we have. That bearing looks fine. Notice how it pulled it all the way out to the side. So that's your clue that the case here is maybe a little bit loose, because instead of the shaft pulling straight from the bearing, it pulled the bearing all the way to the flush with the case before the crank came out. That does not bode well for the other side. Let's just see before we make any big assumptions here. Oh, wait a minute. That's pretty loose in there. Oh boy. If you look, it's case. The bearing has survived. So there's your answer right there. So the steel cage bearing survived the abuse, but that case is probably beyond repair. Here's a Natchy sealed bearing. And you see how that just slips in and out. And not only that, it's got rotation in there. I mean, that's beat up really bad. So here we have yet again another set of cases where the bearing pocket's beat out to the point where the saw can no longer run. But the bearing itself, in this case, was a steel caged Natchy, and the bearing itself had survived. Go figure. So now, you know, the question is, what do you do? I mean, there's really nothing you can really salvage out of this stuff. It's really ruined. You got, you know, some decent components here and there. And I think this is the situation that goes into that category of, okay, maybe now aftermarket cases and stuff makes sense. Well, I tore that saw apart, and the cases were pretty much ruined. The bearings had survived. Those were Natchys. Still have this one on the crank, and it's still fine. Don't think I'm going to use them. But now I have basically a ruined bottom end because I don't have a good PTO case half to use to put these back together as, you know, as an X-Torq. And if you remember, they have a little bit different casting and machining right there to accommodate the longer flange. Here's a set of original edition cases that I've had sitting around for a while. They're pretty good. Now I was hoping to use these on a personal saw, not one that I'm going to turn around and sell. They also have some decent bearings in them, and I'll pop some OEM seals in, I guess, and build something on these. And I think what's going to end up happening is the fellow who wanted me to repair that X-Torq, which is really beyond repair in my mind, is going to be the first person who has an option to buy this particular saw. Here's the top end that came off it, and it was typical of what I was doing at the time with the X-Torqs before I started pulling them off and putting the original edition styles on. You know, radius tier, the intake modified to deflect flow down to the bottom more than the straddle ports, gutted boot, gutted filter holder and stuff like that. I don't know, maybe I'll keep it around and stick it on somebody's X-Torq someday. I wonder if I should go on that one. That's a concept. And it had a pretty decent ignition system. It worked, right? Good carburetor. So this is the kind of things, you get all this junk, right? And have all these different options. Which direction do you go? And where I'm leaning is there's a new OEM Walbro for the original edition styles. I've got a decent 372 original edition style cylinder, right? And so that needs a home. That needs a reason to exist. Maybe it goes on these set of cases. Then I wrap the rest of the X-Torq bones around those set of cases. That's an option, right? Turns it into a running saw. Or, because these OEM handles are pretty beat, maybe I go get an aftermarket handle and put it on this. Maybe I throw it all in a box and just finish doing my 390. That's what I wanted to do today. Lots and lots of decisions to make. In the next video we're going to go through the decisions, and I will pick a direction and do a build. Here's another wrinkle. I've got another one of these pistons from Little Red Barn, and it's an XT pop-up. I don't know if this should go there. So, changing gears to talking about the G372XT and its future. I mean, it runs pretty good, but the ignition on it was kind of weak. So, what I'm kind of thinking is put a OEM ignition on that saw and take one of these take-off carbs. I don't know, just pick one. And I think this was from a 390 though. Right here. But maybe take one of these X-Torq carburetors along with the OEM, late model OEM ignition for the X-Torqs with the better timing curve. And let's take a quick look at this. It came from Little Red Barn. And that is a pop-up piston for an X-Torq. Look at that. The idea is all bolt-on stuff, right? No sending it out to the machine shop. Piston, no base gasket, OEM carb, OEM ignition on the Holzfforma G372XT that already has an OEM handle because I didn't like that blocky piece of crap that was on there. And then do a muffler mod. Now, what comes with the Little Red Barn genuine piston, I've got 3 of them now. You've seen the 48mm build with a pop-up run. It runs very strong. But it comes with an awful lot of information. Good stuff. And I strongly suggest people read this. And it goes through some discussion about what primary compression is, you know, the vac test to make sure you have good seals. And of course what they're trying to do is make sure you've done some due diligence on the saw before you go just bolting on parts, because a lot of times a person will buy that as a solution to a stuck top end, and since the piston looks bad they just want to replace the piston. But in fact what killed the top end was a set of bad bearings, like we see so often. So if you've got a saw that has, you know, a bearing pocket that looks like this, where that thing wobbles around like that, you know, you think you're going to repair that saw by putting a new piston in there after it sucked a bunch of air and fried the old one? You are sadly mistaken. Now I've put some serious oil on this, but look what they've got here. They want you to make sure you understand these are the kind of things you need to know. They tell you how to do a vac and pressure test, which is good information, by the way. And just good stuff. Basically, please make sure that you have a good bottom end before you go start bolting on parts. Of course, this is not from a X-Torq. This is from like a 365 or something, you know. Good information. That all comes in the box that had this piston in there from these people. I've got 3 of these sets of paperwork. I would say for some of you folks out there, just buying one of these pistons for the damn paperwork is a good idea, because there's a lot of good knowledge in this stuff. So, to these folks right here, kudos. I like what you're doing. There you go. There's their address. And that's what I spent for that piston. And all that information. Pretty cool, huh? So I've got a fair amount of X-Torq stuff now, you know, because I've had to do this same operation several times. Now I want to stress that it seems like it happens with the saws that were pre-2015. You know, I don't think I've ever seen an X-Torq later than 2017 that's had like the bearing pocket beat out or the bearings fail. So they've obviously changed. Now, while I'm on that subject, one of the reasons why I believe why we've had some issues is the piston is just simply bigger and heavier, you know. And they've made some changes. They've made these pretty thin wrist pins. Now some of the earlier 372s also had that as well. I'm not sure that wrist pin came with that piston, but I suspect it did. But I've seen some thicker wrist pins. But one area that has definitely changed is the crank. This crank here is from the X-Torq, and that one's from the old style. Take a look at the difference. So this obviously has more weight in the pin that holds the main bearing. Goes along with this lighter piston, right? So that pin, along with the wrist pin and the piston, are all in phase. And on the X-Torqs, they open that up a little bit. So there's a little bit less weight. So you figure out all the pieces that are in phase, you get the heavier piston, but they've lightened up the pin and the crank. And I think that makes a difference on how much they vibrate. But also I think it makes a difference on how long the cases and the bearings are going to last, you know. But back to what we have here. This is obviously a part 1. But I do want to change up this Holzfforma. It deserves better, and I think it deserves a good ignition system for one, possibly a good carburetor. I don't know, that carburetor could be fine, but I've got these, so I haven't decided for sure, but I may put that one on. Same with that piston. But either way, it's going to get the same modifications. Boy, I'm just tempted to put that top end right on that saw. Top end, carburetor, good ignition, pop up. That'd make one heck of a saw. And the question is, would that bottom end survive? I don't know. Good question. But I want the takeaway to be on this video is that survived. These were off a 2013 saw. Okay. Now I want to make another very, very subtle point, and that's this. When you pull the crank, you see how that bearing came to being flush to this case? Because that is where the case splitting tool set right there. It pulled the bearing through the case until it hit the splitter, and then pushed the crank through the bearing after it already moved out here. That's something you got to pay attention to, because when, let's say that was still good, right? So you're just going to put the cases back together, and that bearing is flush to the side of the case as compared to being recessed the way it's supposed to be, like that one. Now, what happens if you attempt to pull that crank through, you know, the seal's out, and you're having your puller on the inside race of that bearing? Are you ever going to get those cases together? No, you are not. And in that situation, what you have to do is make sure you reseat that bearing to where it's supposed to be, like this one right here. And then when you pull to the inner race of the bearing, should that be the type of puller you have, you're not going to sit there and bust it into your crank off as you try to get those cases to close up, and it always being about 300 thousandths short. You know what I'm saying? Something to think about. Whereas if you have the puller that sits on the case, what's going to happen is, as soon as the shoulder of the crank right there hits that inner race and you're still pulling with your puller sitting on this casting right here, it'll pull that bearing right back in. So while that may not be the best approach to reseat the bearing, at least you don't break the end of your crank off trying to get it to close up, and it won't, because it just went solid to the bearing, and the bearing is, instead of being where it's supposed to be, it's like that. Do you get it? But those are two takeaways that you got to think about. One, steel cage bearing survived, and two, when you pull things back together, you got to make sure that bearing is seated properly instead of being like that if you have one of the puller types that pulls the inner race of the bearing. This is the first one of these I got a chance to put on the common service tool. And look at this. How much easier it is to get to that. Alright, let's see a little bit about this one here. It has $92 hours. Runs to 13,260 often. And the numbers on the engine fuel settings are well within the norms. Nothing wrong there. Spends a lot of time idling. If you look down there to see the 59% of his time is idling. So he was complaining at one point that it would be hard to start, and I found that it was flooding itself out, and I wonder if it's because it has so much idle time. So let's see if we can find anything else. It's had error code number 6 once 12 starts ago, so I only had it one time. Let's find out what a 6 is. Defective throttle sensor, throttle signal or throttle malfunction, correct engine speed, corresponding to the trigger movement and position. Incorrect. Had something go wrong with it. Not quite sure if that makes any sense. We'll do a car test and see if everything is working. So let's first go back and see if that corresponds to anything we see. I hear it clicking. Okay. Yeah, that's about right. So it looks like the throttle position sensor is doing okay now. Let's update firmware. It looks to me like it's up to date, so I don't see any sense in doing an update. So what we're going to do is just set those to defaults. I don't think it could be corrupted, but I'll just flash it anyway. Make sure everything's, the way it's supposed to be. It says it has the same version, so this shouldn't do much, unless that version had been somehow hurt. Boy, that chain is in pretty rough shape. See, Husqvarna has gone to these Torques like steel. There's a T27 in there. Tighten those up. But you don't want to get too tight with stuff like that because you just strip out the threads. Well, I think that's about it. Let me put it right back together again, fire it up. I don't know if you noticed, but like the 372, it's got the internal clutch with a sprocket out here. And it has the bar nuts captured by the cover like the 562s and stuff. this one's ready to go back to work. I'm not going to sharpen his chain for him. He can sharpen his own chain. But that means I can go back to work because I have a bunch of stuff here that needs to get done. And that's going to be in the next video.